When analyzing Beethoven's Piano Sonata, Opus 14, number 2, movement 2, the thing that stood out to me at first was the overall structure, the structure or form that the piece seems to have. And so with that being said, that form, from what I've been able to analyze, is an initial theme that is introduced in measures 1 through 8 that is then put through variations throughout the rest of the piece. And going into the phrase structure of this piece, I interpreted it as two large periods. The first one being a parallel symmetrical modulating period that takes place in measures 1 through 8, and the second one being a parallel symmetrical period with a cadential extension that happens. And so going back to the first one, as I said, it's a parallel symmetrical modulating period because the first phrase, measures 1 through 4, is the antecedent, ending on a half cadence, and measures 5 through 8 is the consequent, ending on a more conclusive perfect authentic cadence in a secondary key area, however. And the secondary key area happens in measure 6, I believe on beat 2, as it goes from a D7 to a G, and it kind of like goes through chords that would fit within a secondary key area of G, and then also ends on a G. And then going into the second period, it's not a modulating period as the cadences that happen at the end of each phrase. They do happen within the original key of C, but there is a secondary key area that takes place in measure 11 and kind of into measure 12. And so in that area, it's a secondary key area of F, the predominant of C. And this is kind of hinted at with all of the chromatic pitches that happen within that section. And so measures 9 through 12, which is where that secondary key area happens, it actually ends in a half cadence because by the end of measure 12, it goes back into the original key, back onto the G. And then measures 13 through 16 is, another consequent to that and ends on a perfect authentic cadence. And then, of course, as I said, there is an extension afterwards where measures 17 and 20 kind of build upon that ending in measure 16 and kind of like, they kind of like extends that and then ends in almost the exact same way in measure 20, just an octave lower. With that being said, especially in terms of the chromatics, there are chromatics that do happen outside of these two secondary key areas. The first one in measures 6 through 8, and the second one in measures 11 and 12. There are chromatics that do take place outside of those, and so there are secondary dominants and leading toe chords that do take place outside of those. There are definitely some in there, which is why I interpreted those areas as secondary key areas, but there are some that happen outside of those. And those specific secondary chords, they, for the most part, are meant to like extend and prolong the tonic areas. Like for example, in measure 3, there's a secondary dominant of 3, which then of course, resolves into a 3 and A minor chord. And there are other ones though that do kind of like help to extend the predominant and dominant areas as marked in my score. And going back into the stylistic and harmonic elements that I hinted at earlier, stylistically, the piece seems to play with this sort of style of like a military march, as the song begins with that in measures 1 through 4 especially, but then Beethoven decides to take like the expectations an audience would have from that and plays with it. For example, staying within the first period, in measures 5 through 6, it almost seems like he's building and everything, with especially in measures 6 through 7 with the eighth note, half note, eighth note, half note, it seems like it's building, it's going somewhere. But then in measure 8, he decides to psych the audience out by kind of having it go back into a more like quiet, subdued feeling as was at the beginning of the piece. And then following that in measure 9, he kind of goes into a more legato style and everything. And so, you know, maybe the audience thinks that like, oh, you know, we started off really like strict, like bum, bum, bum. And now we're kind of going to more legato. Okay, this is a nice change. But then in measure 13, he's like, nope, we're going to go back to that original militaristic feel. And then in the cadential extension, he kind of like keeps up with that, with the 8th note rhythms that change with the chords changing. And kind of just sticks with that throughout. Then, of course, as I said, harmonically, you know, the chords change on every beat, and this kind of like stays with this regular harmonic rhythm throughout the piece, and with no real like accelerations towards any like ends of phrases or cadences.